If you travel back to ancient Greece, you'll find great philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, thinkers who considered, questioned, and wrote about things like human nature, morality, ethics, and the very nature of human existence. But do we have to travel all the way back to ancient Greece to find great philosophers? Of course not. In today's video, you'll be introduced to Locke and W.E.B. Du Bois, two great scholars and philosophers who helped shape the Harlem Renaissance. Then we'll go over your lesson agenda, so that by the time we part, you'll be ready to return to 1920s America, which is a lot closer than ancient Greece. The year was 1885. The Civil War had come to an end 20 years earlier. President Grover Cleveland was inaugurated, and Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn was published. It was the middle of the Gilded Age. Industrialism was on the rise, and America's wealthy upper class had fully come into being. It was also the middle of the Reconstruction era, when efforts to fully integrate formerly enslaved African Americans into America's economic and educational systems were attempted, but ultimately abandoned in 1877. This is the world that Alain Locke was born into. Alain Locke was born in 1885 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Locke graduated magna cum laude from Harvard University in 1907 with degrees in English and philosophy. He was among the first African Americans to be accepted into the Phi Beta Kappa Society, and in 1907 he became the first African American Rhodes Scholar. He traveled to the United Kingdom and studied at the University of Oxford. Then he studied in Berlin before returning to Harvard to pursue a PhD in philosophy. Dr. Locke taught at Howard University in Washington, D.C., a renowned historically black university, for 40 years and served as chair of the philosophy department. And this brilliant scholar and thinker used his esteemed position to encourage black artists to explore and express their cultural identity. And for this reason, Locke is often considered the father of the Harlem Renaissance. In 1925, Locke published an anthology called The New Negro. While the title contains terminology we come to avoid, remember that in the 1920s this term was not considered offensive. This collection showcased the works of African American authors whose names will be very familiar to you: Claude McKay, Countee Cullen, Langston Hughes, Jean Toomer, and Zora Neale Hurston. Locke also included his own essays in which he sought to open minds to the possibilities awaiting a culture that was finally free to grow and explore creativity after being oppressed for generations. Speaking of exploring creativity, it was Locke who encouraged Zora Neale Hurston to embrace her unique artistic quest for capturing the sounds of language in specific African American communities in the South. You know, it's important to note that all of these achievements, Rhodes Scholar, Phi Beta Kappa, PhD from Harvard, profound writings, and groundbreaking publications, they were all accomplished during a time when racial segregation was prevalent in American society. Even when he was at Oxford University, Rhodes scholars from the American South refused to share living quarters with him and wanted him kept out of certain colleges, but Locke persevered. He had a vision of something much bigger, much grander, something that would make a lasting impact on the history and culture of America. And thanks to his passion and perseverance, we enjoy the fruits of the Harlem Renaissance today. This week, you'll read Locke's foreword to The New Negro. This is where he sets down the philosophy that drives the entire collection. He recounts social changes that have led to a new world, to a new America, one in which, according to Locke, African American cultural expression is in its adolescence, and it's time for it to mature into the full Renaissance. William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, better known as W.E.B. Du Bois, was born in 1868 in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. That's 17 years before Alain Locke was born and just 3 years after the end of the Civil War. And think about this, when Du Bois was born, some famous Massachusetts authors like Ralph Waldo Emerson and James Russell Lowell were still writing and teaching and making an impact. Du Bois' father, Alfred Du Bois, had been born in Haiti, giving Du Bois a connection to the Caribbean islands and its history, making his lineage a little different from many African Americans of his time. Du Bois graduated from Nashville's historically black Fisk University in 1888 and went on to become the first African American to earn a doctorate at Harvard University. His PhD was in history, and his doctorate thesis was the first book published in Harvard's historical studies. In addition to being called a scholar, thinker, sociologist, and historian, Du Bois is also remembered as a champion of civil rights. He co-founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, better known as the NAACP. In 1909, he used his position and prominent voice to highlight racial injustices and advocate for change. He even served as editor-in-chief of its magazine, The Crisis. The magazine's name was taken from the poem The Present Crisis, penned by abolitionist and Harvard scholar James Russell Lowell in 1948. The Crisis was a revolutionary publication. In addition to its activism and advocacy, The Crisis sponsored literary contests, showcased artwork, and contained a section that was devoted to children. This week, you'll read 2 pieces written by Du Bois. One is called Haiti and Toussaint Louverture. It's a story of a formerly enslaved Haitian who led a successful revolt to end slavery and gain independence from European powers in the late 18th century. With ties to this island nation through his father's lineage, Du Bois shows his admiration for Toussaint Louverture and discusses the far-reaching impacts of his triumphs. You'll also read an excerpt from The Souls of Black Folk, a collection of essays that recounts the legacy of racism in the United States and presents a perspective on progress for African Americans. Pay particular attention to Du Bois' idea of double consciousness, the idea that African Americans of his time had to find ways to conform to white culture while also remaining true to black culture. This term, double consciousness, may have been coined during the Harlem Renaissance, but the concept is not limited to that period of time. The writings and ideas of W.E.B. Du Bois in the 1920s had a profound effect generations later during the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and this concept of double consciousness is still relevant today. This brilliant scholar, while shaping the perspective of his time, was also speaking to the experience of future generations. This week, on days 1 through 4, you'll have PDF readings and activities followed by online practice. On day 5, you'll see the usual, reflection questions, and refresh your writing skills. Then, you'll write a brief essay that compares and contrasts the ideas and messages of Alain Locke and W.E.B. Du Bois. Now that you know that, you can be thinking as you read, and taking some notes about the similarities and differences you find. Of course, you'll wrap up the lesson with an online assessment, and by that point you'll have a pretty deep understanding of the profound thoughts and groundbreaking influence of Alain Locke and W.E.B. Du Bois. If you travel back to ancient history, you'll find records of great philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, thinkers who considered, questioned, and wrote about things like human nature, morality, ethics, and the very nature of human existence. But if you travel back to America's Harlem Renaissance, you'll find some of America's greatest thinkers. In 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King said it like this: "We're going to let our children know that the only philosophers that lived were not Plato and Aristotle, but W.E.B. Du Bois and Alain Locke came through the universe.
Hey, hey.